With a massive 13 proper missions to its name, Halo 2 is perhaps the hardest of any Halo title to create a level ranking on, but I do love a challenge, so I've decided to do just that, and with so much to cover, I don't want to waste any time either, so let's get straight into things. Having played through 2's campaign a couple of times recently, the level I had the least fun with is Sacred Icon. Imagine a sandwich which has a filling made up of even more bread, instead of something delicious like cheese and pickle or coronation chicken. Well, Sacred Icon is the Halo 2 equivalent of that. It's bland, stacked on top of bland, stacked on top of even more bland, a mission so offensively uninteresting, so staggeringly boredom-inducing. The idea at its core is a relatively interesting one, I must say. In Halo Combat Evolved, you fought through ridiculous quantities of Flood, with the goal of reaching Installation 04's activation index, and Sacred Icon is the first half of a two-parter in which you do similar from the other side of the fence, taking on the Flood as the Arbiter to achieve a similar objective. The problem is, you just don't really do anything very absorbing for pretty much the mission's entire runtime, bar a brief section fighting alongside a squad of elites near its conclusion. It's basically a mishmash of fighting Sentinels and Flood, and sometimes both at the same time, in endless grey corridors separated by these admittedly cool vents that I always enjoy jumping down. The vents give you the feeling of constantly travelling deeper into the depths of a rather disturbing setting, and that's about as engaging as things get, with visibility in lower levels becoming ever more reduced as the number of Floods surrounding you increases. For me, Sacred Icon's biggest disappointment by far is that there are clearly Marines also having their own Flood and Sentinel-related difficulties elsewhere in the area, and yet you never meet any of them. Alive, anyway. Battling Marines could, and probably should, have been the unique selling points for this mission. As far as I'm aware, it was on the table at one point in development before the idea was shelved. Allegedly, killing Marines as an elite wouldn't have worked well, I think quite the opposite, and I reckon it would have made all the difference. Suddenly, a very generic romp through lots of monotonous hallways packed full of repetitive enemies would have at least had something of a twist to call its own. Would it have saved Sacred Icon from total mediocrity? Probably not, but it definitely would have made the bread sandwich that it is a little more palatable. You'll likely soon notice a trend running through the first half of this two-parter, which is that most of the missions selected are Arbiter-centric. However, there are a couple with a focus on Master Chief nestled in among them. One of them is High Charity, which takes 12th place, and that might be a surprise to some of you given I recently released a video questioning whether it's the series' worst mission. The biggest issue with High Charity is that it feels like a retread of Gravemind, which it sort of is, except it's not as entertaining. From beginning to end, Gravemind feels suitably epic, with the civil war unfolding around you while the Prophet of Truth narrates events in the background. High Charity, on the other hand, tends to frustrate more than it excites. I like the brutes in Halo 2, as unlike those in 3, they feel like they have their own identity, even if that identity can be an annoying one at times, but when paired with plenty of drones, another irritating enemy, and the Flood, a third foe that gets on my nerves every now and then, what you end up with is a bit of a mess. Fortunately, it is one of the shortest missions in the game, and so the tedium only lasts so long, but it can be a struggle to get through at times. I just feel like it could have been so much more. Flood biomatter has begun to cover certain areas, the air is thick with spores, and the Gravemind also begins to exert his influence. However, Bungie doesn't really take it any further than that. The level design is drab and uninspiring, the encounters at times feel quite unfair, especially the one on screen now towards its finish where the Flood spawn in behind you while you're already fighting brutes ahead of you, and it's over just as it seems like it's really getting going. Apparently there were plans for a Warthog run to be featured at the end of High Charity, and I can't say that news surprised me. In its present guise, it feels like the first half of a level which could have been fairly entertaining if it had a strong second, but because it ends so abruptly, it never manages to get fully off the ground. This next mission was at one point at the very bottom of my list, but clawing its way into an eventual 11th place by the skin of its teeth is the Oracle. There are 3 reasons why I particularly dislike this level. First, I think the introduction of the Flood is handled pretty poorly. I must also hold my hands up, as I have in the past praised it in this regard, but opinions change over time, and mine has certainly changed. 343 Guilty Spark in Combat Evolved is of course the gold standard for how to bring the Flood into the mix, and even Floodgate in Halo 3 I think does a pretty decent job. By comparison, in the Oracle, it all feels a bit forced. Why they're there or what exactly happened isn't particularly well explained, and while your first encounter with them in the room filled with soon-to-be reanimated dead bodies is a fantastic one, their appearance generally doesn't feel like the terrifying prospect it should be. One or two of the elites comment on things like the stench in the air, and watching another squad get demolished by the flood through the floor is something, but Bungie seems in such a rush to get them involved that it's almost as if they forgot about what made their introduction so special previously. Second, this lift sequence is an absolute joke. You stand around forever not doing a whole lot, and I find it astounding it made it into the game at all. It's the worst kind of filler and the most egregious example of a slow-moving platform section in the whole of Halo 2, and Halo 2 is riddled with slow-moving platforms, so that should tell you something. Finally, there's this bizarre Banshee inclusion which really didn't need to be featured at all. It's over in the blink of an eye and just seems rather pointless. That being said, there are one or two things later on which do add some value to the Oracle. Cutting the cables is a nice little set piece which really raises the stakes for events which follow as the mine plummets through space. The escape sequence, a major part of those events which follow, is an exhilarating one too, but with such an underwhelming opening, they're not sufficient enough to push the Oracle any further up my rankings. Hot on the Oracle's heels in 10th place is its sister mission, the Arbiter. This level more than maybe any other I struggled to rank, and while I don't think it would be fair to place it below the 3 missions I've talked about so far, in my view it doesn't do enough to be placed any higher either. There can be no denying that it starts out strong. When I got my hands on Halo 2 for the first time, I expected its story to be a big leap over Combat Evolved. Indeed, I always believed that to be the area in the original with the most room for improvement, but I didn't expect 2's story to end up being quite as good as it is. The Arbiter's opening cutscene in the Mausoleum is an excellent example of just how much Bungie built on that side of things. It's one of the best in the game, and it sets things up really nicely for the mission which follows. Part of a strike team sent to eliminate a group of heretics holed up in a Forerunner gas mine, you infiltrate the area using stealth to begin with, and it's pretty good fun. Halo's stealth mechanics have never been brilliant, but it works okay for just about long enough to really get you into the swing of things. Nothing much happens beyond that, however, until near the Arbiter's close. There's not a whole lot to hate about the middle section, nor is there a whole lot to like. You make your way through lots of brown environments, killing a whole lot of heretics. Flying a Banshee at the end of the level is probably its most memorable moment. While you could pilot one in Combat Evolved if you used your initiative, this section I consider to be its proper introduction, and it's a decent one. The instrumental version of the track Follow kicks in as you engage in dogfights above the mine, and it's pretty engrossing, although I would say the section could serve to be cut in length by a few minutes. Overall, the Arbiter is a very middling level with the occasional bright spot, and that's reflected in its placing on my list. Earlier, I spoke of Sacred Icon lacking a unique selling point, something that made it stand out from the crowd, and it's the complete opposite for the mission which follows it, Quarantine Zone. This level definitely has its very own USP, and that, combined with some fairly robust vehicular combat, is why it finds itself at number 9 on my list. I'm sure most of you watching are aware, but for those of you who aren't, Quarantine Zone is the only mission in the entire trilogy which pits you against the Flood, driving vehicles. Halo Combat Evolved doesn't feature it, and neither does Halo 3, something I've always found slightly strange if I'm being honest. It's something new and exciting, and it remains so for the majority of the mission, as you carve your way through a spectacular number of enemies, including Flood-piloted human vehicles, as well as more rocket Flood than you can shake a plasma sword at. The views you take in are often pretty spectacular too, with Installation 05's library towering over you, and with wraiths filling the skies with enormous blobs of plasma, and explosions and gunfire coming from every direction at ground level, it can at times be quite the visual spectacle. Unfortunately, while the vehicle sections do their job well, Quarantine Zone also has some big problems. The first are the on-foot sections. To put it simply, they didn't need to be there. Sacred Icon, which precedes Quarantine Zone, is stuffed full of more traditional battles against the Flood, and you'll likely have had enough of fighting them by the time it finishes, so I really don't think there needed to be any more so soon after. Also, the gondola ride is not a great way to end things. It's yet another part of Halo 2 during which the pace is dictated not by you, but by the game itself, and it doesn't land well. Cut it entirely and replace it with one final open battle featuring the most vehicles in the mission, and I think you have a pretty powerful climax. Or remove it and add a longer section in the library rather than a 30-second stroll. Again, for me that would have been preferable to the gondola. As it is, Quarantine Zone is a level that is definitely a novelty if not anything else, but eventually it begins to outstay its welcome. The mission I've chosen as the 8th best featured in Halo 2 is one I'm still a little sensitive about to this day, some 18 years odd later. Outskirts could have been so much more than it ended up being. I know I harp on about 2's E3 2003 gameplay demo all the time, but I do so with good reason. It was absolutely incredible. I mean, seriously, there are few, if any, trailers that have ever managed to get me as hyped as I was immediately after watching it back in the day. Not only did it introduce a ton of new features in a very short space of time, dual wielding, vehicle hijacking and the like, but it did so during a level set on Earth that was mind-blowingly dynamic compared to even the best of Halo Combat Evolved. And then Halo 2 released, and instead of that concentrated slice of awesomeness, the first level set on Earth we actually got was Outskirts. I remember standing around waiting for Covenant to arrive in waves during its early stages, trying not to get bored and wondering what had happened, especially considering the opening cutscene of the Scarab shooting down pelicans, which hinted at explosive, fast-paced action to come. The surroundings looked different, I was definitely fighting on Earth, and yet somehow Bungie had managed to capture none of the magic so abundant in that early gameplay demo. To be fair, things do improve later on. Sniper Alley does capture the feeling of engaging in urban warfare, or perhaps urban torture when playing on Legendary especially, and the vehicle sections on the edges of the city set against a burning skyline are well done. Marines join the fight around you, dropships constantly ferry in more Covenant, and for a few brief moments, Outskirts threatens to blossom into something special. But then, just as it looks like things are on the up and up, you spend quite a while fighting your way through a tunnel before the mission promptly concludes. It's another one of those sections so prevalent in Halo 2 which isn't necessarily terrible, but definitely could have used an editor. Overall, Outskirts does a fairly good job of setting up its more entertaining second part, Metropolis, but not enough to really stand out by itself. Taking 7th place is Regret, a mission which, like Outskirts, is somewhat enjoyable, but that also doesn't hit the heights required to propel itself any further up my ranking. If this list took into account Easter eggs, it would obviously be a shoo-in for number 1. This is clearly the best Halo Easter egg ever, and I'm pretty sure it would also take first place in the most slow-moving platforms in one mission category as well. Although, while there are a lot and I generally have an intense dislike for them, surprisingly, I don't mind them quite as much during Regret. After taking down a Covenant squad or two, you travel across one of Delta Halo's lakes using not one, but 2 gondolas, and while there is some downtime, the scenery combined with the track Leonidas and the excellent selection of weapons always on offer means this section isn't too painful. Getting through those up and down early stages is definitely worth it too, as the middle part of the mission is really good. As you travel beneath the lake, you're privy to a bunch of messages between the prophets which give you great insight into the inner workings of the Covenant, and above ground you witness High Charity appear in the sky above you along with a gigantic fleet of enemy ships. Supplementing this is a series of underwater encounters which take place in one of the most striking environments in the whole game. The big fight in the middle of the area is particularly well thought out, featuring 3-lane level design which feels tailor-made for the Halo sandbox, and it really serves to help demonstrate just how robust 2's combat is. It's a shame then that such a strong sequence is followed by a short on-foot section and then more gondola rides, but again you're able to choose from basically whatever human weapons you want to carry, which at least takes some of the edge off. Regret's final moments see you attempting to take down the titular prophet once and for all, and unfortunately they fall a bit flat. On higher difficulties, it can be an interesting section, I suppose, but it doesn't exactly set the world on fire, and hanging onto Regret's chair, punching him in the face to death is sort of funny rather than the crescendo it could have been. When all is said and done, I think Regret is a fairly decent level with a disappointing final encounter that suffers somewhat due to coming after Delta Halo, one of the strongest missions in Halo 2. Kicking off part 2 of this ranking proper is Uprising, an all-out war against the Covenant set against the continued events of the Great Schism. Coming in at number 6, this mission doesn't quite manage to make my top 5 of Halo 2's best levels, but nevertheless it's one I always enjoy revisiting. Its start in particular I like, as I actually find it rather tricky even when playing on normal difficulty, and yes, I know for some of you watching the idea of playing on anything below heroic is blasphemy, and I do agree to an extent, although it also makes it much harder to get passable footage, especially as my gaming skills continue to rapidly diminish with age. It's a narrow section filled with brutes, enemies who are far tougher to take on when there's less room to maneuver, but things do begin to ease up the further you progress as the level begins to widen and more elites join the fray to lend a helping hand, or claw, or whatever they're called. Uprising's midpoint is the biggest reason why it's found itself in the top half of my list. The introduction of Unyielding, one of my favourite of 2's tracks, helps build momentum as you wage vehicular war as part of a nice long sequence featuring plenty of the Halo sandbox, and all in all, it's great fun. Would I have liked some of the areas to be a little more open? I'd say so. I'm a sucker for Halo Combat Evolved's larger battlefields, which aren't featured as much in its sequel, but its narrowness does also lend it a feeling of trying to bust your way through to Installation 05's control room against overwhelming odds. What lets this mission down for me is its lack of story. Halo 2 generally does an incredible job of weaving an intricate tale and manages to nail the story of the Great Schism from dual perspectives. However, I would have liked there to have been a little more meat on its narrative bones, considering it's the third from final mission in the game's campaign. Uprising's final stretch is also a somewhat muted affair compared to that which immediately precedes it, although I am always a kid in a candy store choosing my loadout from this room packed full of almost every weapon 2 has to offer, and I think if Bungie had expanded these closing moments somewhat, Uprising could have staked a claim for a higher place in my ranking. Ultimately, it's a level that does a lot right and doesn't include any major mishaps, which is why it's placed where it is. In at number 5 is The Great Journey. This mission to me is the quintessential Halo 2 level, featuring a little bit of everything so abundant in its campaign. It begins with a vehicle sequence, there's some indoor sections in tighter environments, there's a Scarab, albeit one piloted by Johnson, you fly a Banshee, and it features a boss battle at its conclusion. Like Uprising, it's not the strongest from a story perspective, however. The opening cutscene which begins The Great Journey isn't very awe-inspiring considering it's the last mission in the entire game, where you'd expect there to be a little more fanfare, although the standoff between the Arbiter and co and Tartarus 2/3 of the way through is a lot better, but it's Halo 2's ending where things really fall apart. Bringing in Earth as a key part of the Forerunner's plans is admittedly a great twist, and one that builds plenty of intrigue as the game ends. Having Master Chief's last words be "Sir, finishing this fight," on the other hand, was the biggest tease ever, given there was a lot of hype prior to 2's release about battles on Earth and the like. You do get a few in Halo 2, but it does feel like the game ends just as we're getting to the good part, and it's also rather abrupt. Most of the Great Journey leading up to that does help soften the blow at least. The open section at its start is another that brings to mind Combat Evolved sections of old, and it's difficult not to get excited fighting alongside hunters rather than fleeing in terror from them. Taking to the skies in a Banshee to support Johnson is a spectacle too, and is in my view by far the best flight sequence in the entire game. Battling Tartarus, I'm undecided on. In principle, it's a good idea, with the Arbiter given the opportunity to strike his biggest blow to the Covenant so far by taking down the leader of the faction which replaced the elites. It's not the most fun though. You unload into Tartarus, who can kill you at a moment's notice until he hits the deck, and while the layout of the area itself is interesting, I think there could have been a bit more to it. Weak final boss or not, taking on Tartarus wasn't enough to sully the rest of the Great Journey, which deservedly finishes in the top half of my ranking. Finishing just shy of a podium position in 4th place is Cairo Station, perhaps the best introductory mission Bungie put together during their time with Halo. Its only real rival, I think, is the Pillar of Autumn, but they're both fantastic for different reasons. Halo Combat Evolved's opening level is an amazing example of how to bed players into new mechanics, while at the same time crafting an engaging experience. Cairo Station, on the other hand, does still do this. There would of course have been many players joining the franchise for the first time with 2, yet it also manages to be a more compelling affair overall. Halo 2 is all about the story of both Master Chief and the Arbiter, and Cairo Station's opening cutscene really serves to illustrate the contrasting situations both find themselves in at its start. While Chief receives praise for his accomplishments in front of his peers, the Arbiter goes through a very different ordeal as he's tortured and branded for his failures in front of a baying audience. It's brilliant. What follows is also equally terrific, as you fend off the Covenant as they attempt to blow up the station. The scenario itself is very very similar to the Pillar of Autumn, but everything has been turned up to 11. You're constantly given opportunities to look out into space to get a better sense of scale, and you get to witness one or two very explosive moments occurring nearby too, which sets the stakes for the rest of the mission. The environments you find yourself in also tend to be a bit more expansive than those on the Autumn too, and that again helps elevate its gameplay beyond that featured in its predecessor. I'm of the opinion that Bungie at times struggles to close out levels into, with Quarantine Zone's gondola ride, Regret's underwhelming boss battle of sorts, and Uprising's fairly uninteresting finale being good examples. However, that's not the case with Cairo Station. Its final third is packed full of surprises, whether that's taking the fight outside the station, meeting drones for the first time, or battling your way to the bomb you need to defuse. And of course, who can forget about its closing cutscene, another marvel in a game featuring so many excellent cinematics. The Last Spartan provides a suitably epic backing track as Master Chief plummets through space to return the Covenant's bomb to them, and well, just look at it. Cairo Station may have just missed out on one of the top spots, but that doesn't mean it's not a level with a whole lot to offer. Taking home a very respectable bronze medal is Gravemind, a level I never in a million years thought I'd rank as high as I have. I used to hate this mission, I used to detest it, I used to often skip it entirely whenever I played through Halo 2, and I was wrong to do that. Over the years, my opinion of Gravemind has softened greatly, to the point where I actually look forward to it nowadays. With regards to gameplay, this might be the weakest level in the top half of my ranking, which may be a controversial opinion to some of you out there. In my view, Gravemind is a slog, a long hard slog. It's a slog that can be great fun as you watch the Great Schism occur in real time across the Covenant city of High Charity, choosing when to enter the fray as your enemy's own conflict rages around you, but especially on higher difficulties, it can also be a brutal challenge, testing even those who really have the skills to pay the bills. At the same time though, the chaos that swirls around you and the many deaths you'll no doubt encounter because of it makes Gravemind what it is, and it wouldn't be at all the same without it. It's also a huge part of Halo history, introducing the equally poetic and horrifying Gravemind during its opening stages, scenes which had me on the edge of my seat, and it also has that encounter at its end. I will always contest the idea that a Breaking Benjamin track thrown in almost at random was an altogether appropriate thing to do, but it works. It's cheesy and marvellous, and I wouldn't have it any other way, and I also recently learned that the band gave Bungie the track for free too, so fair play to the lads. In a way, that particular moment sort of sums up Gravemind. It's messy, it's chaotic, it's a bit all over the place, but it also has a lot of heart, and sometimes that's all you need. In the first part of my rankings, I made the claim that the mission which precedes Metropolis, Outskirts, was a bit of a disappointment, and I stand by that. I was incredibly excited to take on the Covenant on Earth when Halo 2 released back in 2004, and it just didn't really scratch the itch I had for Halo's brand of combat in an urban setting. The level just missing out on the top spot on my list, Metropolis, however, definitely did. It's quite the opposite of Outskirts in some regards. Where Outskirts begins with an action-packed cinematic, Metropolis by comparison is much calmer, with one particular line from Sergeant Johnson being its standout moment. Conversely, where Outskirts failed to live up to its initial promise when it came to the gameplay side of things, Metropolis excels. The bridge sequence which kicks things off is tremendous. It's hardly the most subtle section in the world, but it's a bloody excellent one. Wave after wave of ghosts race down the bridge towards you, wraiths target you from afar, and eventually Bungie throws banshees into the mix too, ramping up the difficulty in a lovely smooth manner. In service of objectivity, I do have to be honest and say the section which follows is a bit rubbish. You end up back in the same or a very similar tunnel to that you spent quite a while in during the back half of Outskirts, except it's nowhere near as good a second time around, and it wasn't exactly the most entertaining thing to begin with. Thankfully, Metropolis doesn't take long to get going again, as you fight your way through some well-designed vehicle segments before the scarab that's been threatening to halt your progress for some time decides to really make itself known. Let's be honest, this level is all about the scarab really. Compared to later battles with them in Halo 3, it may not be a set piece which stands up as well as some others looking back at it, but at the time it was exhilarating. Boarding the scarab and putting an end to its reign of terror was quite unlike anything that had been seen up to that point in the series, and it really demonstrated Bungie's ability to craft unique encounters. While I do think the next mission on my list deserves to be where it is, I must admit Metropolis nearly, so very nearly, came out ahead. If you watch my recent video about this mission, which you can check out by clicking the card on screen now, then you won't be too shocked to hear that taking home the title of best level in Halo 2 is Delta Halo. If I'm being brutally honest, there were occasions when I wondered what exactly had happened during the transition between it and Halo Combat Evolved. Not only is the second game in the Halo series a much narrower affair in general, which in fairness isn't necessarily a bad thing, for me it also at times lacks some of the more open combat areas its predecessor revelled in throwing you into. Delta Halo, I think, is the best example of where Bungie gets it right. Is it still narrow? During some parts undoubtedly, but when you're driving across the plains of Installation 05 for the first time, or blasting your way through ruins in a Scorpion tank, any issues tend to drift into the background, replaced by pure entertainment. It starts out very strong too. This cutscene featuring a grunt minding his own business playing with his toys, which change depending on what difficulty you're playing on, is still one of my favourite Easter eggs of sorts in the entire series, and what's featured around it is rather awesome too, as Master Chief and a squad of Marines hurtle towards that very same grunt, who in my view was minding his own business, doing no one no harm. Once you set foot on the series' second ring world, you're treated to a battle to get further inland, which starts out strong but does kind of stall towards its conclusion, with the Covenant backup which arrives once you've secured the area and the Pelican that's ferried in for you after, often taking quite a while to arrive. What always jumps out at me most when I play Delta Halo, however, is its pacing. Halo's best missions have a wonderful ebb and flow to them, short sharp bursts of action punctuated by fleeting moments of calm, and during this level, that design philosophy is on full display. Whether you're in a vehicle, on foot, or switching between the two, Bungie constantly introduces new elements to the sandbox to keep you on your toes, perhaps best evidenced by this fantastic multi-level final encounter which helps end the mission on a high note. On balance, Halo 2 is by a whisker the title in Bungie's trilogy I revisit least, but with levels like Delta Halo included, it still always manages to keep me coming back for more. And with that, we reach the end of part 2 of my ranking, with Delta Halo crowned Halo 2's #1 mission. As always, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch the video, boys, girls and Spartans, and please do get in touch and let me know what your list looks like too. I'd love to find out. Do also consider perhaps liking and subscribing to make sure you don't miss part 2, and fingers crossed, we'll meet again soon.